So Damon, you wanted me. Okay, this year is for the refuah of Shifra Simcha Bat Yeta, Adi Luri. Any other names of you that you guys have got?
No, unfortunately,
Even the English names of people.
not at the moment. Sorry.
Zelma Bat Rachel and others, all Cholim of Klal Yisrael.
Amen.
So Damon asked me to prepare something on the 9 days, the fast of Tammuz. So I'd like to just, I'm just going to read it. I just copied it to a Word document. I'm just going to say a few things here. So the 17th of Tammuz, the fast of that day, precedes, that's the start of the 3 weeks. And it all culminates on Tisha B'Av, which starts Saturday and this Motzei Shabbos and ends on Sunday night. So the 17th of Tammuz, negative things happened to the Jewish people. And the first thing was the Jewish people were worshipping the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, and he broke the tablets. During the Babylonian exile, Jews were forced to cease offering the sacrifices due to there was a lack of sheep. And then Apostomas burned the Holy Torah. An idol was placed in the second temple, and the walls of Jerusalem were breached by the Romans in 69 CE. The Jerusalem Talmud also maintains that this is also the dates when the Babylonians breached the walls of Jerusalem on their way to destroying the first temple. Okay, so what does it say? It's a fast. That's a fast day, and you then 3 weeks later you do the fast of Tisha B'Av. So, okay, just gives people who exempt about fasting. We're not going to cover it all. You can ask a Rov or a doctor, or mainly a Rov if you exempt from fasting, depending on your condition. Okay, let's just continue. Okay, so that happened. Then, during the 3 weeks, let's just see. Okay. Let's just find. Okay. During the 3 weeks, which is now, I'm just going to add this in. Negative things happen. Now look what's happening in South Africa. It's the 3 weeks now, and please God, it'll be over by next week, or at least calming down substantially. So this is it's not a good time for Jews and in the world. And if you know, another thing which which Damon knows and Gavin may know, maybe you know, Arthur, is that people shouldn't undergo litigation during this time, because the muzzle isn't so good for Jewish people during the 3 weeks. After the 3 weeks, you get different parshas, and you get the first Shabbos after Tisha B'Av is called Shabbat Nachamu, which means Shabbos of comfort, and then you have others. So it's to get people back into a normal, hopefully happier frame of mind, and to have and a less serious time until we approach Rosh Hashanah. So that's other than that, nothing else to add. Anything else, Damon? Is it anything that you know, or Gavin?
No, you did a good job.
So now, and that's not a nice thing, but this is happening now during the 3 weeks. This violence and unrest, and it's obviously and COVID is still rampant in certain countries. So that's it basically. That's all I need. All I need to say. And then in terms of and you reduce you reduce very importantly during the 3 weeks, you reduce your happiness or your joy. So you don't eat meat and drink wine, with the exception being on Shabbos. That's the only time you can eat. And if there's a bris or a simcha during the 3 weeks, that's the only exception. But you shouldn't eat meat or wine, and no music, no shaving, no.
During the 9 days. I thought you just done it during the 9 days. The rest of the 3 weeks
the 9 days. Sorry, the 9 days, not the 3. The 9 days, not the 3. The 9 days, not the 3 weeks. The 9 days, because meat is people have meat at joyous occasions, and it's like you celebrate, you have meat. So I don't know. For me, I don't know. I don't see the joy in eating meat even during the year. It's not doesn't give me great happiness and simcha. But and when you have meat and wine, you celebrate. So that's, and then you're not supposed to have haircuts and shave.
And
can I ask you a question? What happens if it requires you to shave them? What do you do about that then?
No, you can shave if you're going to affect your career for business reasons, but not for pleasure reasons. Not if it's itchy, but if it's going to affect your perception of people have.
I hate shaving, but I shave every day now because of work. Because I hate that. You know me. I like my beard grow normally.
Yeah, you haven't had a beard for a long time. But also, and some people, like they say, the Shabbos preceding for the week of Tisha B'Av, people should be a bit stricter. I mean, depending on the circumstance, like you say, professionally about shaving. So let's say Tisha B'Av starts on a Sunday night, it's only one day you basically have to be strict with not shaving. But it's like now it's actually a week because it starts on Motzei Shah. It starts on Saturday night. So it would have been a whole week this week. People who observing the laws of it would have to not shave, and not shave. I mean, music most people don't listen to. But if it was on Sunday night, it would only be one night because it's from the Motzei Shabbos to the start of Tisha B'Av that week, where that's what some people hold by.
Okay, perfect. All right, what we're going to do at this point is we're going to do 10 minutes left of this and then send a new 40-minute link. I'm only 50 minutes. That's all I need. All right. I'm just going to give you a few-minute summary of yesterday because obviously people were exhausted, which I completely understand. So basically, guys, there was a ruling by Rav Shimon ben Lakish who said the owner of an ox that killed a slave unintentionally, for which the ox is not liable to death, is absolved from a 30 shekel payment normally imposed on one whose muad ox kills a slave. And the reason being is that there's a juxtaposition of the owner's penalty being a 30 shekel fine and the ox's punishment, stoning, and obviously it indicates that the owner is not punished unless the ox will receive its punishment. There's a correlation. That's according to the Kovo Yeshua. Okay? So then the Gemara wants to know source for this ruling, at which it gives. For if it's stated, and where's the source? The source is in Shmot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 32. And it states, if the ox shall gore a slave or a maidservant, 30 silver shekels shall he give to his master, and the ox shall be stoned, implying that whenever the ox is punished with stoning for killing the slave, the owner pays 30 shekels to the slave's master. But if the ox is not punished with stoning because it killed the slave unintentionally, then the owner does not pay 30 shekels to the slave's master. Okay? So far, that's the correlation between the 30 shekel payment and the stoning of the animal. Now, we want to know what happens. There's a similar correlation according to hi, Stephen. How are you?
Thanks, you, Dan.
Good, mate. Right. Lovely to see you.
Thanks, yeah.
So there's a similar correlation, guys, according to Rabba. And Rabba is supporting Rav Shimon ben Lakish. And he said, look, just like you have that correlation between stoning of the ox, and in that particular case, it's a 30 shekel fine for killing a slave paid to the master. If you don't kill the ox, then you don't pay that 30 shekel fine. So when do you not pay that? When do you not kill the ox? Well, the Gemara's example was unintentionally. In other words, the ox was trying to attack another ox. It missed. It killed a slave. And in that case, it's not eligible. It's just like a Jewish person that tried to kill an animal and missed. just say he shot a bow and arrowed it and the animal ducked out of the way and some Jew was behind him, then he goes to the city of refuge for a accidental murder. That's not premeditated. So too, just like you wouldn't put the Jew to death, you can't put the property of a Jew to death on the same basis where he loses. So Rabbi says, listen, we can make the same correlation with kofir. How do we make the same correlation? Well, very simple. He was saying that the owner of an ox that kills a free person, somebody that's not a slave, unintentionally, is also absolved from the payment of kofir. So Rabbi has a biblical source too, and that's in Shmot chapter 21, verse 29 to 30. So it's stated basically in regard to a muad that kills a person, the ox shall be stoned and even its owner shall die, when kofar shall be assessed against him. So this implies that whenever the ox is punished with stoning for killing a person, the owner pays kofar. But if the ox is not punished with stoning, for example, like if it killed unintentionally, it's not liable to the death penalty. Then the owner does not pay kofar. So now the Gemara questions Rabbi's ruling. It says, the questioning comes from a buyer. So a buyer challenged him from a particular Mishnah. We learned this, that the Mishnah itself was in Ketubot 41a. It was mentioned on Bava Kamma 15b, but it was only in reference to Ketubot 41a. And what does that say? Well, basically the Mishnah says, if a Jew says, my ox killed so-and-so, or he says, my ox killed so-and-so's ox, the person pays on the basis of his own admission. Okay? So what do we mean if the person pays on the basis of his own admission? It's obviously talking about a muad ox, according to Rashi. Why is it talking about a muad ox? Well, very simple. According to some of the Rabbonim, as far as a tam payment is concerned, it's considered by some as a mammon, compensation, half compensation, and some as a knas, a penalty. And how does the thinking go? It's a penalty. Well, if your ox is tame and chilled, you weren't in breach here where you have to pay compensation. The ox has got a very calm nature. So the fact that you're paying a penalty is just to make you very super aware in future. And therefore, we learned that if you quickly admit to the crime before the court, I think before court-appointed judges, it doesn't even have to be the court, because what we don't want to do is trouble the court. We don't want to trouble a court case. That's actually why you get off a penalty. But if you're going to drag somebody through court processes, it's going to aggravate the person and aggravate the court. So if the witnesses race you to it and they beat you at the finish line, it doesn't matter if you confess afterwards. The only time you don't have to pay a knas, a penalty, is if you beat the witnesses to it. And you say, listen, I did bad. Classic case we learn is of the thief. A thief stole something. He stole a laptop, and then he felt bad, and he said, here's your laptop back. It doesn't mean that he can admit to it and not return the item, but he doesn't have to pay the double penalty if the laptop's worth 6,000 Rand by returning the laptop and pay another 6,000 Rand. As long as he returns the item, it doesn't aggravate the court. So that's really straightforward. We said that there's certain indicators that make something a kanas, a penalty. What are those indicators? The fact that it's a fixed payment. So when we look at a rapist, a seducer, defamer, etc., we learned that if you're paying a set amount, like 100 shekel fine or whatever the case may be, that is an indicator that it's a penalty. How do you know? Because if you created 2,431 rands worth of damage and you're paying back 2,431 rand, that's compensation to repay the loss at which the damage you caused. If you say you're only paying back 1,000 rand, that is a penalty, because you're not paying back in order to compensate the family directly, measure for measure, what you cost them. So the fact that it's fixed, that's one thing. The second thing that indicates that it's a knas, a penalty, is that by your own admission you can get off the hook. Those are the two relevant factors out of the three here. So what a buyer is saying is, look, we've got a problem. My problem with Rabbi is Rabbi said, listen, the oxes and stones, you don't have to pay kofir. And he's saying you do have to pay kofir. If you say my ox killed so-and-so, you pay for damages. Or when the Mishnah Ketubot says my ox killed so-and-so, my ox killed so-and-so's ox, you pay for damages. My ox killed so-and-so, meaning a person, you pay them the kofir. And it says this person pays on the basis of his own admission. So, which means it's muad, because if it was a tam payment, say for example you had a tam ox and that tam ox killed somebody, you would not pay kofir in that case because we learned the owner of the ox is absolved. There's a special verse. Okay. Let me just put it to you like this. So basically, the Mishnah is illustrating the difference between payments that are based on the amount of damage inflicted, which can be imposed on the basis of one's own admission, and those that bear no relation to the amount of damage, like the 30 shekel payment imposed when one's muad ox kills a slave. So with regards to the latter payment, the 30 shekel payment, some of the Rabbonim say it's in the category of a fine because it's a fixed amount. How do we know this? Is because it says if your slave was worth a dinar or a seller, you still paid the 30 shekels. So then clearly it's not about compensation. So we're talking about, hang on, this case with the buyer is talking about something in response to killing a free person. Okay. So why are we saying that you pay that the owner of the ox pays the kofir by his own admission? So what's the question there? Well, it's very straightforward. The ox doesn't get put to death. So basically, if a Jew admits to killing another Jew, they don't give you the death penalty because you cannot incriminate yourself. And therefore, because you cannot incriminate yourself, it's parallel to the case where a Jew owns an ox and he cannot incriminate his ox to give his ox the death penalty. So therefore, even though it's a muad ox and it's not considered a knas, as in a penalty, but it's mammon compensation, in this particular place, Rabbi is turning around and saying you only pay kofir when the ox is stoned. If the ox kills unintentionally, you don't pay kofir. A buyer is saying it's not true. In this particular case, you do pay the kofir, and the proof of it is if the owner admitted his ox killed, his ox is not stoned, because it parallels with you can't incriminate yourself when somebody admits to a human murder. So therefore, on that particular basis, he's saying that actually proves that you still pay kofir, because the Gemara is going to continue. Just hang on for me 1 second, guys. No cranberry. And it's basically saying a buyer presents his challenge as follows: is it not so that with regard to the admission that his ox killed so-and-so, that the Mishnah refers to payment of kofir? Now, ox cannot be executed on the basis of its owner's admission, yet the Mishnah rules that its owner is nevertheless obligated to pay kofir. Okay? So the Gemara wants to know, well, how would Rabbi respond to this? So Rabbi said, listen, I understand what you're saying, that you say that he still pays kofir even though we don't kill the animal. Rabbi is saying you don't pay kofir. What you do is pay damages. Although the Torah exempts the owner from kofir, he's nonetheless liable for the damage his ox inflicted on the victim. Okay. So how does this work on a practical halachic basis? And then we'll get started now. It works as follows, is that on a practical basis, we learned the halacha that kofir payment does two things, as Gavin quite rightly said yesterday. Number one, it provides an atonement for the one that was meant to look after his ox. Why? His ox was a habitual gorer that had a track record of damaging or killing other animals specifically. And what we say is muad for animals is not muad for people. So this ox was clearly, if it's muad for people, and it didn't get the death penalty because of the reasons we spoke about last Gemara, this person is responsible in heaven for causing a death of a Jew which could have been avoided had he just taken the necessary precautions. How do we know it could have been avoided? Because this animal on multiple times acted very dangerously, and the courts warned him. So in that particular basis, it's an atonement for his soul for this unnecessary death. And there are some halachic opinions that say you pay it based on the owner of the ox, because just like he should have lost his life, and in the hands of heaven he's worthy to lose his life, so too he has to almost exonerate himself by paying what his life is worth, the damager, the owner of the damaging ox. But the halachic opinion by most parts are turning around and saying we actually base it on the victim. And how do we base it on the victim? Because the verse says, and refers to the Gezerah Shava, where the verse turns around and says that if a woman had a miscarriage, what the value of the fetus, that's what the damager pays. And it uses the Gezerah Shava with the same two words as we learned before. So this implies that you pay on the value of the victim. So that in a way does make sense, because why? It uses the term pays his life. So we're saying his, meaning what the value of the damager's life, because he should lose his life in Shemaim, or his life, the victim of whom he caused his loss. So what we're saying is it's based on the victim. Why? Because you need to do the second part, and that is compensate the family. So here we have a problem where we've got a buyer and Rabba turns around and says, yes, we call it damages. And the buyer says, well, I call it kofir. And the reality is, what is the practical difference? So if you want to say it's paid based on the value of the victim, there's not really any damage, because when a person's ox, there's not really any difference in that regard, because when a person's ox damages, you base it worse than what the victim is worth in the slave market. Okay, so how do we say what the victim is worth in the slave market? Let me put it to you like this. Say the person is a plastic surgeon. Now, if he was based in Los Angeles and he was doing breast augmentation or nose jobs for the rich and famous and foolish, and he charged a fortune for surgery, and now all of a sudden somebody reversed the car and broke his $1 million hand, and it can no longer do that surgery, and you say you have to compensate the person based on his surgical practice in Los Angeles or Hollywood, the guy would go broke that damaged him. So we're saying, no, it's not his value of his what he would be in private practice as a surgeon. We say what he would be like at Baragwanath Hospital doing surgery. And in that particular case, he's earning a government salary. That's what his worth is on the slave market. That's the difference. There's a huge difference. So it doesn't impoverish the person that did it. It's a happy medium. You know what they call a compromise, where both parties are miserable. So what's the practical difference? If Rabba turns around and says it's based on the value of the victim, and we call it kofir, and in that particular case, you don't pay kofir, and a buyer says you do, but Rabba calls it damages. Well, if it's based on the victim, there's no difference, because if we assess the victim and he's injured, you pay according to that injury. If he's worth nothing anymore because he's dead, you pay his full bodily injury of what he's worth in total. So proportionate to the damage you pay. So practically there would be no difference. There's only two major differences. The first difference is what happens if you say it's based on the damager, on his life. Well, there you might have a difference. The family might be short of money, because if the damager was a skillless person that was super skinny, he'd get nothing on the slave market. Where in fact the victim might have been 300 pounds and a Hollywood actor, because if they sold him by body weight, he'd be worth a lot. Or if he had talents, he might be worth a lot. Who knows? So in other words, it's not equatable in that particular case. The family might get more, the family might get less. But it's only an equal sum when it's based on the victim. We don't mind if it's called damages or kofir. There is one halachic practical difference. If you've got an ox that's worth maybe 60 zuz, puny thing, but it was trying to attack another ox, right? And the other ox moved out the way, and it gored an old guy in the heart. Okay, perfect aim, puny ox. Then that damage, if it was assessed at 300 zuz, then if it's considered damages, you would only have to pay based. Say the guy say he didn't have any assets that you couldn't take from choice property, because it is muad. You don't take it from the damaging animal. If he's got a puny ox and that's all he's got, and he comes from Soweto, that's all you can take is that 60 zuz. So if you take that 60 zuz, the family is still short 240 zuz, but there's nothing they can do about it. However, if it's a kofir payment, then because your life is standing in the balance in Shemaim, in that particular case, you have to borrow big and steal the money in order to have a kapora in Shemaim. So it's seen much more as halachically stringent if it's considered kofir as opposed to damages, because damages and kofir both compensate the family, but only kofir provides atonement. Am I making sense, guys? All right. So Abaya doesn't like Rabba's answer and says, no, the Mishnah refers not to kofir but to damages. And he says, although the Torah exempts the owner from kofir, is nonetheless liable for damages his ox inflicts on the victim. Okay? So all we're saying is, it's very straightforward, is that Abaya isn't happy with Rabba's answer. He said to Rabba, if indeed there exists liability to damages in cases where kofir is not assessed, then consider the latter clause of this Mishnah. One who says, my ox killed so-and-so slave, does not pay on his own admission because the 30 shekel payment imposed for this act is a fine, which is not imposed based on one's own admission. So now a buyer is going to go into why is using this as a base. And if one is liable to damages in cases where there's no kofir or the 30 shekel fine, why does the Mishnah rule that the ox's owner doesn't pay anything? He should be liable to pay the value of the slave as damages, which is not a fine and can be assessed on the basis of the owner's own admission. Okay? So what he's basically saying is, look, just as you maintain that there exists an obligation to compensate the heirs of somebody that's not enslaved and they're free for the death of a victim, so too there exists a monetary liability for the death of a slave. So in cases where the owner doesn't satisfy this claim through the payment of the 30 shekel fine, because it wasn't satisfied with regards to kofir either, according to Rabbah. Rabbah saying that even if the ox is muad, kofir by your own admission means that the ox isn't stoned, therefore you don't pay kofir, and the 30 shekel fine you don't pay for a similar reason, is that you can see it as a knas, a penalty, because of the fixed amount nature of it. And he's saying, look, you should still be able to satisfy the obligation by paying the full value of the slave. I mean, that's Rashi's explanation of a buyer. Since the Mishnah absolves the owner entirely, it's evident that there's no liability that exists for the death caused by one's ox other than kofir in the 30 shekel fine. So he's saying, guys, where does Rabbah get this from? That you just switches kofir for damages? Because the very fact that we don't do that for a slave is proof of it. Why? Because what he's saying is, look, if for a slave you pay 30 silver shekels and you don't pay it because on your own admission, just like for kofir you don't because the ox isn't stoned, but here you don't pay it because the ox isn't stoned because you're the owner. Or if you want to say it's because it's considered a knas, a penalty, you still don't pay it. Either way, the Torah lets a person off the hook with regards to the 30 shekel damages. So why doesn't Rabbah answer the same and turn around and say, look, just like you pay kofir if the ox is stoned, but if it's not, you don't, and you call it damages. In this particular case, all you're doing is instead of paying the 30 shekel fine, you say, well, what is the slave worth? Let me compensate for the damages for the slave, pro rata to the slave's worth. But you don't mention anything like that. There's just mention of no payment. So what is Rabbah's answer to that? So Rabbi said to Abaye, I could rarely answer you that the first clause of the Mishnah refers to damages, and the latter clause refers only to the 30 shekel fine imposed for killing a slave. However, I will not answer you with the forced answer. Rather, I'll answer both this first clause and that second clause referring to a payment for damages. So you're saying, hang on a second, let's just understand what Rabbi is actually saying here, okay? So he's saying, look, the owner is still liable for damages. The intent of the Mishnah isn't to absolve him entirely from liability, but it's just to demonstrate that the 30 shekel payment is a fine which cannot be imposed on the basis of the owner's admission. In other words, he's saying that the two clauses of the Mishnah refer to different types of payments. That's Rashi's explanation. So, I mean, if you look at it, Rabba's suggestion is very difficult to understand because the whole point of the Mishnah is actually trying to demonstrate the difference between the payment imposed when one ox kills a free person, a Jew that's not enslaved, to which he's liable on the basis of his admission, and that which is imposed when it kills a slave, to which his admission doesn't make him liable because the 30 shekel fine is seen as a knas. How do we know it's a knas? Doesn't matter if the slave is worth a dinar or a selah. We don't pay what the slave is worth. So if you don't pay what a slave is worth, it's not deemed compensation. It's then deemed a penalty. So according to Rabba's forced answer, there isn't a difference at all. In either case, the owner is not liable to the payment specifically imposed by the Torah when one's ox kills a person, either for the kofir or the 30 shekel payment, in a case where the owner obviously admits to it. But he is required to pay damages. In other words, that basically, Tosfot explains that according to the opinion that kofir is assessed at the value of the victim. So that's a view accepted by halacha. The payment for the Torah imposed view for the death of the free person kofir is about the same payment, okay? But the problem is the 30 shekel fine, usually imposed for the death of a slave, is a fixed amount, and that bears no resemblance to the obligation of damages, which varies according to the slave's value. So the Mishnah, you can explain it as follows. The monetary obligation, the Torah specifies, imposes on the owner of a muad that kills a free person, for example, is in all intents and purposes payable even on the basis of the owner's admission. Okay, it's not an atonement for his guilt, but it's at least compensation for damage for the family that his ox caused. However, if you take the specific payment of the Torah imposed where the victim was a slave, 30 shekels, it's not payable in any form based on the owner's admission, since it's a fine. Rather, the owner is liable to a different payment altogether, the value of the slave. Okay, so that's basically Rabba's answer to a buyer. Okay, so the Gemara says, however, whereas in the first clause the owner is obligated to pay damages, in the second clause he is not, for the following reason. When the victim was a free man, in which case the ox's owner in certain circumstances pays kofir, even by his own admission, and in which case, where is this so? For if witnesses come and testify that the ox killed a person and is liable to death, but they do not know if it was a tam, in which case the owner is exempt from kofir, or a muad, in which case the owner is liable for kofir, and its owner says that it's muad, in that case he pays kofir by his own admission, since in fact the ox is liable to be executed. Okay, so I want to ask you guys a question. How do we know the ox is liable to be executed in that case that I'm speaking about now, this latest thing? Do you want me to repeat the statement if you can't answer the question? Okay. Arthur says yes, Gavin?
I'm just a bit out of the stack. Just carry on. Just let the guys answer, but just to repeat it, I think.
All right.
I'll do my to drop on screen. Go ahead.
Okay, so look, Rabbi is saying as follows. In the first clause, the owner is obligated to pay damages. What first clause? About the kofir. In the second clause, he is not, for the following reason. And the second clause is what? About the, what do you call it, about this slave with the 30 shekel payment. So let's study this. So we're taking a case, guys, where the victim was a free person. He wasn't a slave. Okay? And the owner of the ox pays kofir even by his own admission. And when could this be where the owner pays by his own admission? Very simple, when they're witnesses. Why?
Is it kofir? What kofir, Damon?
Kofir, yes, good. Kofir is as an atonement payment because, Stephen, your ox was muad.
Yes.
In other words, was habitually warned that it was dangerous. You didn't care, and as a result, the ox killed another Jew. So kofir means at the hands of heaven, Hashem holds that person responsible for negligence. It's not like a tame ox that you couldn't predict its nature, and it just went crazy one day. That's a different story to where the ox was tame. So here we're saying, listen, the only reason that the owner doesn't pay kofir when he alone is testifying that his ox did it is because you can't, if you admitted to a murder, self-incriminate yourself and get killed as a Jew. Okay? But if witnesses come against you and you admit it, but they're witnesses that can prove it, one still gets the death penalty because they're witnesses. You can't incriminate yourself, but you can certainly be incriminated by others. So what it's saying is here, yes, the owner came and admitted it, but there were also witnesses that saw the event. So he thought he was going to get out of it, but he wasn't going to get out of it. Does that make sense? So it doesn't matter. So in that particular place, in that particular case, guys, he pays kofir. Okay? And they say, but he only pays kofir if the animal is a muad. If it's a tam, he doesn't pay kofir. Well, very simple. Why? Because let's examine this again. If it was a tam, the suggestion was you pay half kofir. Why do you pay half kofir? Because just like when you tam damages, you pay half payment damages, this would parallel and say you pay half kofir. And what did we learn? Is that if you had to pay kofir, that other rule applies that you have to pay kofir from the body of the attacking animal in the case of tam. And since the animal with witnesses, if the owner admits to it, gets stoned, then he doesn't pay the half kofir because you're paying with what? An animal that's going to get stoned. You've got no benefit from it. And then Rav Eliezer turned around and said, yes, well, the owner by his own admission in that particular case could not obligate without witnesses, but he still pays. You would be liable for half kofir unless you use that verse, the owner of the ox is absolved. Okay? So what we are saying is here, if witnesses come and testify that the ox killed a person and is liable to death, but they don't know if it was a tam, in which case the owner is exempt from kofir, or a muad, in which case the owner is liable for kofir, and its owner says that it's muad, this is the case when he pays kofir by his own admission, since in fact the ox is liable to be executed because there was witnesses. Because kofir is not a fine which cannot be assessed on the basis of one's admission. The only reason it's not imposed when the owner admits that his ox killed is that the obligation is contingent on the execution of the ox, for which one's admission doesn't suffice. But since in this case the ox will in any event be executed through the testimony of witnesses, because the ox is subject to execution regardless of whether it killed as a tam or muad, the owner's admission that is liable to kofir suffices to obligate him. That's what Rashi says. Okay? Then where there are no witnesses at all, he nevertheless pays damages. So Rabbah says, look, if there are no witnesses, we replace kofir with damages, but either way the victim's family, if it's paid on the basis of the victim, earns the same amount. It's just there's no need to pay for the atonement aspect in that case. And what is the parallel case that illustrates this? For if witnesses come and testify that the ox killed a slave, but they do not know if it was tam, in which case the 30 shekel penalty does not apply. Why? it's not about, guys, that the 30 shekel penalty doesn't apply with the slave if it's tam, because it's a penalty. It's because it's tam. It's because it's tam. Because with the tam argument, we said that in that particular case, you can't pay from the body of the attacking animal because it's stoned, and even if it's not stoned, the owner of the ox is absolved, comes to absolve you. So even for the 30 shekel fine, you would pay if the ox is muad. And the reason why, bless you, the reason why you wouldn't pay in this case, if you're eligible for muad, for the 30 shekel payment, is because a person cannot incriminate himself, nor can he incriminate his ox, because it's seen as a kanas, a penalty, as long as there's no witnesses. So it was saying, for if witnesses come and testify that the ox killed a slave, but they do not know if it was tam, in which case the 30 shekel penalty does not apply, or muad in case the penalty does apply. Why would it apply? Because if they're witnesses, even if you admit to it, you don't get off the hook. It's only if there are no witnesses. And the owner pays, it is muad, the fine is not paid by his own admission. When there are no witnesses at all, he does not pay by his own admission either. So we confused here by Rabba's answer. I'll tell you why we confused, and I'm going to give you an explanation. Rabba is saying that if there are no witnesses for the muad payment, if your ox kills a slave, you don't pay the 30 shekel fine. We know that. Why? Because if there are no witnesses, if you admit to the crime, you don't pay a penalty. But he's saying even if there are witnesses, you still don't pay a penalty. So how can that be? It's a very, very simple answer, is that the response is as follows. Well, the question is basically, when a man, basically, you know what? Why should the fact that the owner's admission not obligate him to pay the fine or killing of a slave exempt him from damages when they're witnesses? Okay, so when a man admits to being liable to a fine, the reason he's exempt from paying is not that his admission is insufficient grounds by which to obligate him. The proof is that the law is if a person admits to a fine and afterwards witnesses appear and testify about the incident to which he admitted, he remains exempt from paying. This is the opinion of Rav, which is now the accepted halacha. It's in the 75th daf. Now, why should this be so? Since we now have the testimony of the witnesses, we do not need to rely on the person's admission in order to know what transpired. We must conclude that the defendant's admission in this case of a fine is accepted by the court in lieu of the fine. By admitting the person is considered to have having paid the fine, the witness's testimony can therefore not make him pay. In other words, if you admit to a fine, you're exempt from paying it, okay? And you can't be obligated to pay damages because it's as though you've paid the fine before. So let me just explain this in a simple sentence. You come, there are no witnesses, and admit that you stole a laptop, okay? And then you say, I've got the laptop. You give the laptop, but if you didn't admit you stole the laptop and witnesses came against you and the laptop is worth 6,000 Rand, you'd have to give back the laptop and pay 6,000 Rand or just pay 12,000 Rand if you got rid of the laptop. So the penalty is the actual compensatory amount plus double, plus an extra amount. So you're paying double back, but you're paying the amount of 6,000 for the compensation, another 6,000 as a penalty. So you're paying back double what you stole. So what it's saying is, if you admitted to this before there were any witnesses and witnesses come, your testimony is as if you've paid the fine, you're off the hook. And since you're off the hook, even if witnesses come afterwards, then in that particular case, you're considered having paid by admitting. And therefore, in that particular case, Rabba's answer to Abai is saying, look, in the case of kofir, we don't make him pay kofir, we make him pay damages. But in the case of the 30 shekel fine, when he admitted to it, we don't make him pay that money in lieu of damages of what the slave is worth, because his admittance to the fine is as though he's already paid the fine, and then we don't include damages over and above that. That's the halacha of Rav. So the bottom line of it is, if you steal something, quickly run to the court and admit you did it, so you only have to take back the item, because if witnesses come first, you're paying double, but you still have to return the original item if it's theft. But in the case of damages, you're off the hook because you have admitted, and therefore that's considered payment. Does that make sense? Okay, so
damages and penalties.
No. So what we are saying is as follows. No. What we are saying is, Rabbi is saying, in a case where you don't pay kofir because your ox is not stoned, you still pay kofir based on what the victim is worth. And since you don't pay kofir because the atonement aspect isn't there, because you can't incriminate yourself, you pay that equal value in damages, because it's what the victim's was worth anyway. So principally, you're paying the same. We call it damages, not kofir. A buyer isn't happy, and he says, well, what happens with the 30 shekel payment that you pay to the owner of a slave? Why don't you just replace that with damages? Because if the slave is not worth 30 shekels, he's worth a seller or a dinner or whatever, pay what he's worth. You switched kofir for damages, do it in this case. And Rabbi said, I won't. And he said, well, what sort of answer is that? If you want to say you can switch one, why can't you switch here? That proves it's a penalty. He said, I know it's a penalty, but we go according to the halacha of Rav, which is accepted now in the 79th stuff, which says, if you admit to a penalty, then you don't have to pay it. If witnesses come afterwards and say what you did, your testimony is considered penalty. So since it's almost as though you've paid the penalty, you don't pay penalty and the damages. That's why I don't switch from penalty to damages, because by his own admission, it's as if he paid the penalty, and therefore we don't make him pay penalty and a damage. However, if there were witnesses and he didn't testify on his own before the witnesses got there, we turn the 30 shekel payment, it would seem, into damages. No, we wouldn't have to, because by that stage, you just pay the 30 shekel fine. Wouldn't even have to be converted to damages. That's it, guys.
Perfect. Thank you.
Am I making sense?
Yep.
I'm still a little confused, but it'll sink in. Maybe I'm just tired.
Just ask me any question you want, mate.
No, I understand, but I mean, he's paying 30 shekels no matter what, whether it's damages or whatever. It ends up being the same thing. That's what you're saying.
Are you talking about the kofir or the slave, or do you which question?
Yeah, when for the slave, for example, right? Obviously, like if there's no witnesses and he's the only one to, because like you said, you need 2 witnesses before you can prosecute someone. Okay, if he's doing it himself, and it goes from being it's instead of a kofir, instead of being a kofir just to damages.
It doesn't. That's my point. It doesn't. It doesn't. What we're saying is as follows. Okay, I wanted to end the share early, so that's why we ended early. But I just want to answer Arthur's question. Arthur, what he's saying is initially, this was the exact discussion with Rabbi. Rabbi said if the animal isn't stoned because the owner of the animal can't incriminate his ox to the death penalty, because there's a parallel between a Jew not being able to self-confess and get himself killed without witnesses, nor can he get his animal killed by being stoned, by saying what happened with the kofir payment.
That's where the 2 comes in, the 2 witnesses.
So what we are saying is very simply, if he doesn't pay kofir, he doesn't pay kofir if the animal isn't stoned. There's a connection between the stoning and him paying kofir. So in cases where the animal isn't stoned, he doesn't pay kofir. So there's a problem with that. Rabbi is turning around and saying, look, in that particular regard, he still pays because he damaged somebody. Because the logic is as follows. If you injure somebody and you have to pay with what they're worth, why wouldn't you have to pay what they're worth if you kill somebody, which is even worse?
Okay.
So he says, of course you pay. And since we work out kofir payment on the value of the victim and damages on the value of the victim, yes, it's the same amount. And why not compensate the family? You should. You have to. But it doesn't have that kofir element. Just like a death sentence provides atonement for a person that murders. Kofir provides an atonement for the owner of an ox who was negligent when his ox murdered some Jew. So, in other words, the atonement aspect isn't there, but he still has to pay damages, because if you hurt somebody and damage them, why wouldn't you pay damages to the family if you killed them?
That makes sense.
And then there's a problem with that. So what's the problem? Why isn't the ox stoned in this case? Well, the Gemara's example wasn't about somebody admitting it themselves. They were using a case of when his ox kills unintentionally. That was the case. But it doesn't matter, because Rabbi Eliezer said there's certain cases when the ox isn't stoned. It always parallels killing one's ox, according to if a Jewish person would get the death penalty. So,
Damon, the problem with the problem with stoning it means they can't get any benefit for it, and
correct.
Therefore you can't pay anything. So that's where the problem comes in.
Correct. That's exactly it. So that is perfectly it. So even you can't stone it when the animal kills unintentionally, because if a Jew tries to kill an animal and kills another Jew, goes to the city of refuge, he doesn't get killed. Same thing with the ox. If a try to attack an ox and ox got away and killed a slave or a free Jew or whatever, ox doesn't get killed. But instead of paying kofir, he pays damages, same amount. But then Abai is not happy. Abai says, so I get that, but then what happens is, what do you deal with the slave? Because we don't say that if somebody's off the hook because the slave, the ox doesn't get stoned, it just says that you no longer have to pay the 30 shekels to the owner of the slave. It doesn't say you have to pay for damages for the slave, because damages is compensation. The slave, if it's worth X, you should pay X. He said, why doesn't it switch from the 30 shekel payment? Because you damaged a human being. You damaged somebody else's property. Tell your buyer's logic. A buyer is saying, if I owned an ox, which is my property, and your ox damaged my ox and it was muad, okay? We're talking muad. You would pay full damages from choice property for my ox. Now, all of a sudden, you killed my property, which is a slave, and you killed a human being. Your animal killed a human being. Even more so, you should pay the damages. How do you take a 30 shekel fine and suddenly drop it and owe me nothing? If you hit my stupid ox, you would have paid full amount. Now you're telling me you pay me nothing. Okay?
Yeah.
So,
and also, he lost the value of the slave of what it would have been worth.
Correct. But the slave owner is saying, listen, you owe me 30 shekels if your ox was stoned, and you would have owed me 30 shekels. Now that your ox isn't stoned, why don't you pay me damages? That's what a buyer's saying. Why are you off the hook? Because even if you damage something not as valuable as a human being, but a stupid ox, you would pay me back for a muad ox from choice property exactly what you damaged. Here you don't pay anything. It doesn't make sense. And Rabbi explains it, and we're going to end on this note. Rabbi explains it saying, look, it's different in the case of a penalty, because a penalty, by your own admission, you get off the hook. So let's not talk of a case of unintentional killing. Let's not use that. I don't know why he doesn't use the example, because I don't know how he'd answer it with an unintentional killing. It's a problem. He can only answer this if it's the owner admitted to it. Because if the owner admitted to it, because it's a knas, a fixed amount, he doesn't have to pay. And because he admitted it, it's considered like in the court as if he paid by his admission. His admission is a form of payment. So then witnesses come and say, we witnessed such and such, and he must pay. He says, look, I already paid by admitting it. Therefore, I don't have to pay for the slave, and I don't have to pay for damages, because by my admitting it, I've paid. Now, my problem with that answer, and I'm not arguing with Rabbi, is I would love to see what Rabbi says in a case where it was an unintentional killing. Because for an unintentional killing where the animal isn't stoned, and the owner, firstly, he wouldn't admit. I suppose he'd admit to it just to get himself off the hook. But it just seems like you could just get off the hook by quickly admitting it, even if witnesses come afterwards. That's the only part that doesn't quite make sense. It's the quickest run to the courthouse you've ever seen between witnesses and the person that's admitting to a penalty. I must tell you something.
the whole thing about admitting it's actually against your nature almost, because it's almost like
No, if you told me I owed 10 grand and I could admit it and not pay it, you'll see me run to the courthouse. It's perfectly according to my nature.
and yours. For most people, owing 10 grand is different to like I actually killed someone. It's like a different level of for me mentality. Like people like owing 10 grand and admitting that you killed a life or a life